Hello, I'm George Liston, CA. Welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. The image of Osama bin Laden sits starkly at the center of the war on terrorism. Yet for all the rapt fascination he compels, few detailed studies have emerged of him that provide a multi-dimensional portrait of the man and the environment which formed him. This omission is addressed by Peter Bergen's new book, The Osama bin Laden I Know, which is an oral history of al-Qaeda's leader based upon the accounts of those who have known him longest and best. Peter Bergen, welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you.
Let me hold up a copy of your book for all to see, Peter. And it's a very dramatic cover, I must say, and a very good backdrop for my first question, because the book is what it promises. It's a full story of how this man evolves, if I may use that word. And like all of us, he's a product of his innate qualities and the circumstances which form him. I'd like to go right back to his very early years with you, Peter, and kind of the first chapters of this book. This is a shy and rich young man who comes of age in a very fateful period for Muslim youth. There's something that we call the sahwa going on. Tell us a bit about that and how it shapes him.
Well, the Sahwa was a sort of religious awakening, and just as Christianity has had periods of religious awakenings, there was one in the Islamic world. Basically, it came out of a crisis, I think, the 1967 war, in which Israel defeated Egypt, Syria, and Jordan in the space of a few days. Really threw into question the whole nationalist, socialist program that had been gripping the Arab world, and this came at the same time as religious resurgence. And bin Laden was born in '57. He was a very religious teenager. I talked to his boyhood friend who he played soccer with, and bin Laden stuck out as somebody who was praying 7 times a day, fasting twice a week. So he was already in this kind of frame. And the Islamic awakening, he joined the Muslim Brotherhood apparently at quite a young age. It really informed his youth. And then, of course, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in '79, that's really when he, this sort of rather quiescent kind of religious feeling, and this rather quiet, you said shy also, guy, started to actually put his religious beliefs into action.
Right. Well, in fact, that '79 is a fateful year, is it not? I mean, he's 22. We have the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which is going to be very important. We both want to focus on that, I know. But also, we have the fall of the Shah, do we not?
Yeah.
I mean, we don't have these events sort of conspiring to make the world even more.
And Sadat signed a peace agreement with Israel.
Exactly.
And the Mecca, the Holy of Holies, was taken over by a group of religious militants. Sort of basically and of course Osama was very horrified about the way the Saudi royal family dealt with the takeover of the mosque. So, it always, he was a young guy, all these incredible events happened. And also it was the beginning of the year, the new century in the Islamic calendar, interestingly.
Oh, yes,
so, I can but speculate to some degree about how important this was to him, but I think it was very important to him.
How familiar was he, because these are all the sort of experiences that the world is witnessing at that point, but intellectually, was this also the period in which Syed al-Qutb, if I pronounce it correctly, the Egyptian thinker, was influencing Muslim youth as well?
Well, yeah, definitely. Syed Qutb had been executed in 1966, but his work, in death, he became this huge martyr of the movement, and his works were incredibly influential. And Osama bin Laden's brother-in-law, who was also his best friend at university, tells how they would go to Mohammed Qutb's lectures in Jeddah at university. Mohammed Qutb being the keeper of his brother's flame, the interpreter of his work. So, yeah, Syed Qutb's message was a pretty radical one by implication, which is that if a Muslim regime is not ruling in a Muslim way, then you should overthrow it. And of course, that was a message that the Egyptians, who began to influence bin Laden in the '80s, they had taken that very much to heart. And they basically saw these regimes as apostates. Now, that is kind of a new development in Islamic thought.
I want to pick up on that, particularly the influence of the Egyptians on the way Osama bin Laden is thinking. But just to stay on this particular point of these other influences on him, do we take it correctly, Peter, that this is not just Osama, perhaps, reacting in this way, but that whole class and cadre of upper middle class youth? I mean, are they beginning to get disaffected with, alienated from their governments?
It's a whole generation, and the most militant of those went to Pakistan or Afghanistan to actually fight the Soviets, and in fact these governments saw these guys as sort of a threat, and They recognized this was a genuine popular movement, and of course these people got more radical as time went on.
Right.
A lot of them went back to their own countries after the war was over. But yeah, I think it was a generational thing, and it's still playing out.
Yeah, the point you make about the Soviets seeing them as more radical, of course, was right on point, because they were proceeding in that direction. And Afghanistan as a place where Osama would sort of undergo his next major transformation, if you will, or at least progress forward, is extremely important to us. Your book brought out something for me, and I think for many others, that I had not known, that, and correct me if I got this wrong, but it seems to me his venturing forth into Afghanistan to take on the Soviet challenge, which must have just outraged him, was at the first instance a product of his interest in or allegiance to Abdullah Assam. Is that correct?
Abdullah Assam, yeah.
Abdullah Assam, who it was leading Islamic youth to Afghanistan for a service mission. Is this correct?
Yeah.
It wasn't originally a militant.
Yeah. One of the things I
expression.
discovered in the book is I'd always thought that Abdullah Assam, somehow Al-Qaeda came out of Abdullah Assam and bin Laden. And in fact, Abdullah Assam is an incredibly important figure, by the way. He one of the sort of founders of Hamas, in a sense, the guy who created this international jihadist movement. But he had a very kind of, his view of jihad was basically it's getting non-Muslims out of formerly Muslim lands. The people who began to influence bin Laden were talking about overthrowing Middle Eastern governments. Assam wanted no part of that. Eventually he was assassinated, very possibly by people in bin Laden's circle in '89. But you know, bin Laden, when he went into Afghanistan, that was really the transformational moment, because he began to have the courage of his own convictions, and he basically set up his own Arab military force, which from a strategic point of view made no point at all. I mean, there were only a couple hundred, 300 Arabs in Afghanistan at any given moment. Putting them all into one unit to fight the Soviets was a military blunder.
And I want to ask a very specific question on what he did in terms of forming that Arab unit within the resistance to the Soviets. But in making that transformation again, or that step from the influence of someone like Assam to this more militant posture, do we see at that point the influence of the Egyptians coming in? Who's persuading him to do that, or who's helping him come to that point?
They kind of happen contemporaneously, because bin Laden goes into Afghanistan 84, 85. He sets up a camp very near a Soviet military base. Now, if you're it doesn't make any sense to set it.
Jiri? What's it?
Oh, Jaji it was called, yeah. You know, he actually set up the camp near the Soviet military base so it would attract enemy fire. Well, that's a military strategy. That's pretty dumb. As a sort of effort to win martyrdom, you know, it probably is a good idea. But so he was doing that, and then the Egyptians started being involved there, and Ayman al-Zawahiri, of course, now the number 2 of Al-Qaeda, met bin Laden in '86, and Ayman al-Zawahiri saw, but I mean, this was a marriage of convenience for both of them. Ayman al-Zawahiri had spent 3 years in Egyptian prisons. He had his own jihadist organization. He was much more sophisticated politically than bin Laden. Bin Laden, on the other hand, you know, everybody knew he was a multi-gazillionaire, and they also knew that he had sort of leadership skills. He demonstrated at this Battle of Jaji that he was, you know, whatever else he is, he's not a coward in the sense that he actually fought the Soviets personally. Even though it didn't make any difference to the larger strategic picture, he did take on the Soviets. So Ayman al-Zawahiri and bin Laden entered into this marriage of convenience, which continues to this day.
The character of that marriage of convenience, I think one of the things you want to make you do make a strong point of in this book, is that Zawahiri, influential as he is, should not be seen as his puppeteer. He does not.
Indeed. There would be two, I mean, the kind of conventional wisdom is that Zawahiri is the brains of the movement, but a lot of the people I talked to in the book who either had been associated with Al-Qaeda or whose testimonies I drew upon because they've written for newspapers, or they dismiss this idea of bin Laden being Zawahiri's creature. And I think that's true. I think initially that may have been true, but it seems that bin Laden was the guy who persuaded Zawahiri to start attacking the United States, rather not, you know, because Zawahiri's goal has always been the overthrow of the Egyptian government.
That's right. In a sense, again, the phrase in the book is go from the near enemy to the far enemy, or the ultimate enemy.
And they made a strategic design. You know, it was a kind of a dumb move at the time. And one of the kind of surprising things I found in the book was that a lot of the jihadists around bin Laden thought that 9/11 was a dumb idea, because while it was a tactical success, you know, it was a strategic disaster. You know, they lost the Taliban, which is what they regard the one modern Islamic state. Al-Qaeda was decimated. All these guys were on the run. And a lot of them saw it as very counterproductive. And in fact, one of bin Laden's sons, by the name of Omar, who's in his early 20s, actually left him, sort of in disgust. So, you know, one of the ironies is that this group was more or less on the ropes in the a year after 9/11. They had serious problems. There were no if you look at the pro-bin Laden demonstrations around the world after 9/11, they were small. if you, on the other hand, look at the anti-Iraq war demonstrations, they were very large. So the Iraq war re-energized these people, it's given them a new base. It's been the most hubristic, incompetent, and counterproductive exercise in recent American history, and has played into their hands rather well.
Had there not been an Iraq war, but it continued focused on Afghanistan?
We would probably not. You wouldn't be booking me on the show, I think. I have no idea, but it happened. It certainly, when you have Belgian females conducting suicide operations in Iraq, we're in a very different. You may remember November 9th, 2005, a Belgian female with her husband went on a kind of weird sort of honeymoon-style vacation to commit suicide together and attack American troops. That is a whole different world. We've energized these jihadist movements. We're seeing very small numbers now, but we're seeing cases in the United States of people wanting to fight in Iraq, training. We're seeing cases in Canada. We're seeing cases in Spain. We're seeing cases in Germany, in France, and French people dying in Iraq. Now, the Iraq war or wars could go on for a very long time.
So it's probable then, from what you're saying, that the next wave of terrorism sponsored by al-Qaeda can have a European face.
No doubt. I mean, when we get attacked again, which, at some point I'm sure we will, it'll be somebody with a European passport. I mean, Richard Reed, the so-called shoe bomber, was a British citizen. He wasn't a Pakistani. So Zakiri Moussaoui, who's just recently been sentenced to a life sentence, is of course French.
Right.
So, and why, they're not going to repeat the same thing again. They're going to do something different. Yeah. And we are seeing in Europe, people becoming very radical. I mean, there's a group of people who are very radical.
Peter, at the core of this book is your own interview with Osama bin Laden. And of course, the book is a quite gripping account of many people's takes on him. I'd love to get your particular take on the genius, if you will, of his leadership, or what makes it work. For example, going back to the first Afghanistan chapters of his life, he does form that all-Arab group, I think it's called Masada al-Ansar,
yes.
Lion's Den or something, which makes absolutely no military sense, but may have been a brilliant strategic move in some way. I'm just trying to get a sense of how does he maintain the influence that he has?
It turned out to be a good public relations move. Because some mainstream Saudi journalists started covering him, Egyptian filmmaker came in, and bin Laden's always had a media strategy. I mean, to some degree, I produced the first television interview he'd ever done for, for CNN, and he's wanted to, like any all actors on the political stage, or in, we live in a media world, and these are not dumb people, so they have a media strategy. Right now, of course, they're using the internet. They don't even have to go to an Al Jazeera to get their message out. It just goes on the internet, everybody sees it. But I mean, my impression about it, why is he successful as a leader? I mean, I think there are several reasons. First of all, he has, in Hollywood terms, a great backstory. Son of a multi-billionaire fighting the Soviets personally. Right. He is, by all accounts, a very humble, shy, retiring guy who, he's sleeping on the floor.
An ascetic, really.
Very ascetic, like a monk, living like paupers. In fact, one of his oldest son left him in disgust, and one of his wives in Sudan, when they were living there in the 90s, saying, "We got millions in the bank. Why are we living like paupers?" So, I think that's all the attractive part of him. The unattractive, and also he ran this organization. We're finding, in fact, in the Moussaoui trial, there was a lot of new evidence introduced, and in the new version of my book in the paperback, I'm putting some of that in. Bin Laden ran this thing as a totally top-down organization. There was a Shura Council of sort of consultative group. But if Bin Laden said, 98% of them said do something, and Bin Laden said no, it was Bin Laden's word. Bin Laden, for instance, Bin Laden appointed Mohammed Atta to be the lead hijacker. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the operational commander of 9/11, could fiddle with the details, but I mean, Bin Laden was in charge, so he not only was he, kind of had this attractive thing, he was quite a dictatorial leader. Now, but his big mistake is he believed his own propaganda. This is the worst thing you can do. He believed the United States was a paper tiger, that with just one or two hits we could pull out of the Middle East. Well, we did pull out of Beirut in '83, and we did pull out of Somalia in '93, which is his analysis. But we're not going to pull out of Washington after we were attacked. Yeah,
that's why I keep wondering about what he expects to achieve from all of this.
He wants to clash the civilizations. I mean, Samuel Huntington is a fan of Samuel Huntington's, because he believes the clash of civilizations is inevitable, and that his version of Islam is going to win. Now, the likelihood of that happening is, I think, very low. But that's what he wants.
In the wake of the Afghan wars, as he proceeds with this sort of charismatic style that you've just outlined for us, there is a point where he goes to Sudan.
Yeah.
I think. This I find very interesting because, again, I must once again employ the word transformation, or at least this accretion of motives and tactics. It seems to me, Peter, that in the wake of the Afghan war, with the success he's had and the need to deploy this force he's built, in going to Sudan, he begins to get, or at least express this interest in a more globalized, doesn't he not? I mean, more countries come into his sort of list of targets, more a greater sense of there being enemies beyond the ones he'd first dealt with?
Yeah, I think that's right. He starts thinking about the Saudis as an enemy, which he hadn't done in the 80s. He begins to plan to attack the United States. He sent people to Somalia. Yeah. But also at the same time he's doing that, he's really living, he's one of the biggest businessmen in the country. So he's sort of living this. And I think there are some of his friends who feel that, there was a moment in Sudan where he may have, perhaps he would have just transformed himself into something more of a, financier of Islamic extremist movements and not gone down the terrorism path. But, for one reason or another he did. And I think, of course, the pressure to send him out of Sudan appeared to make a lot of sense at the time. But sending him back to Afghanistan turned out to be a huge blunder.
Well, there are moments in Sudan when, to put it quite bluntly, this country could have taken him into capture, couldn't it? Well,
there's a sort of debate about that. I think that I think that's overblown, to be honest. I think we may have made some. The Sudanese were offering intelligence on Al Qaeda after Bin Laden left that we maybe should have taken earlier rather than later. But I don't. There wasn't. When Bin Laden was in. When Bin Laden was in Sudan, there was no indictment against him. He committed no crime. I mean, there was no judicial. You can't just. There wasn't an indictment against him really. I think there was a sort of secret indictment against him maybe in '97.
Speaking of American action, as people have talked about it over the years or speculated upon it, I think you also make a strong point that we should not see him as a creative creature of the CIA. That during those Afghan years, as many have argued that we sort of made him, we did not do that.
The argument is always made without any evidence. I mean, there's no CIA officer who was his case officer. There's no, there's no bank statements. It just didn't happen like that. The real story is that the CIA had no idea who this guy was until late '95 when they decided to set up a Bin Laden unit. And that, it was, both sides had reasons that they didn't want to deal with each other. Bin Laden was anti-American since the 80s. In the book, people say that he was boycotting Sprite and Pepsi because of US support for Israel in the early 80s. And, so this guy is anti-American. That anti-American turns into hatred with the US introduction of troops into Saudi Arabia in 1990. But
he's very exercised about that, isn't he? I mean, the troops in the Holy Land, as he put it, or the Holy Place.
You know what he's really exercised by now? I'm just, the most recent statement. If you read the whole thing, he has issued something very similar to the Rushdie fatwa against the Danish cartoonists.
I read that, yes.
When I read this, you read it, these guys are potentially. This is actually serious. I mean, there are people out there who
will act on that.
Might act on that.
Well, and something else he's issued quite recently. I wanted to get your opinion on, in addition to the cartoon issue, is Darfur.
Yeah.
As he's called for Al-Qaeda action in Darfur, which seems to me to be, and in some sense I was kind of puzzled by that.
I was puzzled too, because I mean, obviously he spent 4 years in Sudan from '92 to '96. He knows the country pretty well. I mean, don't forget, Osama is also a very paranoid guy. He saw Operation Restoring Hope in Somalia to feed starving Somalis as part of a US effort to kind of grab big parts of the Muslim world. We don't want to grab Somalia. I mean, who does?
Well, not me.
I mean, it's a disaster, right? So. But he sees this, any kind of Western intervention in the humanitarian crisis in Darfur, he probably sees as sort of an imperial effort to grab bits of Sudan.
Exactly, but his reading of some of these things strikes me as somewhat bizarre.
Well, he's never visited the West, or if he did, it was to Sweden when he was 14.
That's right.
Yeah.
In addition to Osama bin Laden, the book introduces some other very important pivotal figures I think few know much about. Let me just go down a quick list with you here. For example, Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, who I think was connected with the '93 attack on the World Trade Center. He's been imprisoned here, but I think few Americans have understood his importance as kind of a religious blesser, if you will, of Al-Qaeda's actions.
You asked me that. You're one of the few people who's actually picked up on that.
Well, there you have it. I read the book. So.
Sheikh Rahman is an Egyptian cleric. He's in American prison since '93, as you say, and it's important to understand that Ayman al-Zawahiri and Osama bin Laden have no stature as religious figures, and so for them to need to do anything, they have to get clerical sign-off, and they've occasionally gone to Afghan clerics or Saudi clerics, and what the sign-off, they really needed a big sign-off for 9/11 because they're attacking American civilians. Believe me, there's nothing in the Quran that really allows you to do this. So I found a fatwa from Sheikh Rahman that took the shape of a plastic card that was distributed at an Al-Qaeda press conference in '98, in which he called for attacks on American corporations, American planes, American ships, It's to my mind the first time that anybody said these kinds of things. Now, it's not clear if Rahman wrote this himself or his sons, who are also in bin Laden's circle, wrote it for him or whatever. But it fits with some of the things he's also said in the past.
Yeah.
And they needed, Sheikh Rahman is a major clerical figure, a graduate of Al-Azhar University, which is sort of the Harvard of Islamic thought, a senior cleric, and also the spiritual guide of the Egyptian militants who make up the key parts of Al-Qaeda. So Sheikh Rahman was, I think, an underappreciated part of the story.
A religious legitimacy they otherwise could not have obtained.
I think so. I mean, they either dummied this up in his name or they got it from him. He was able to issue statements from prison. He's not able to do it now. There are special administrative measures in place that prevent him from speaking to anybody except his wife.
There's another personality introduced early, and then he disappears quickly because he died, was murdered actually, and that's Ahmad Shah Massoud in Afghanistan when Osama gets there. And the interesting thing about he is murdered on the 9th of September 2001, 2 days before the events in this country. He was, by all accounts, an extremely charismatic leader who, had he survived, might have been something of a rival to Osama.
Well, I mean, no doubt. I mean, I met both of them, and Massoud is, an amazing guy. He was somebody with an immense charisma and integrity, somebody that was a very nice guy to be around, and very kind of thoughtful and interested in Sufi poetry, an Islamic fundamentalist for sure, but somebody who was orientated towards the West, spoke a little French, would have been, if Massoud, you go to Kabul today, there are pictures of Massoud everywhere. I mean, he is the national hero. And of course, bin Laden, one of the themes of my book is that Massoud represents sort of an alternative thing that could have been bin Laden.
And because he represents that alternative, and because he lived among us, walked for a time on the, one speculates at least that there could be other rivals to Osama bin Laden. In other words, I began to wonder at least about fissures in the movement or possibilities for it, or how solid is this appeal that he has, or could someone arise to take it away from him? Has too much been conceded to him as sort of a...
Well, that's a very good, that's a very good question. I mean, there's two parts to that. One is, like all revolutionary movements are fissured and split, and they hate each other more than they, the nominal. So, one of the themes of the book is also like how much splints and fissures there were in the organization, how much disagreement there was with bin Laden, even amongst people within Al-Qaeda. But you ask actually a better question, which is, could a leader really arise who would be a counterweight? And that's, one of the problems in a good part of the Arab world is that, none of the leaders are exactly elected by the population. So, that's, until that happens, it's hard for authentic voices to kind of, and the other thing, of course, is that bin Laden is a genuinely popular guy, and much of it, basically, because he stuck it to the West. I mean, just boil it down.
But it's interesting on that popularity. I've seen polls at least that something like 50% of the Islamic world may find him appealing in some sense, but less than 5% will want him running their countries.
Well, I was going to mention that very poll. It's a poll in Saudi Arabia, and I think that gets to the real, actually, what's really going on here, which is that the silent majority in the Muslim world, the vast majority of the Muslim world, do not want to live in a Taliban-style regime, from Indonesia to Morocco, as bin Laden wants. They kind of get it. They do admire bin Laden because of his perceived incorruptibility, the backstory I mentioned, the fact that he stood up to the West, the fact that he seems to be replicating in some parts of the life of the Prophet Muhammad in a rather self-conscious way. But I think they understand they don't want to live in the kind of bin Laden, utopia. And in the long term, that's good for us because, one of the reasons that we won the Cold War is that we presented a much better narrative compared to the Soviet Union.
Well, let me refer to the book myself in this instance, because this is in fact brought forth in this book, I think, in one of the, how do I phrase this, not suggestions, but, well, I'll call it a suggestion at least, that Zawahiri, I believe, is at some point telling Osama, you've got to cultivate the masses, or some.
That's one of the themes towards the end of the book is that these guys suddenly realize, hey,
they've got to do that, but so do we. I mean, that's the way I read it. I mean, that's really where the thing is going to be.
Well, that's true, but they realize they haven't connected with the masses, and one of the letters Zawahiri sent Zakawi in Iraq is enough with the beheadings. It's turning off our popular support. And in fact, Zakawi has stopped the beheadings. So, and that recent Zakawi tape kind of indicates to me that he's trying to position him. He's not previous pictures we've seen of him, he's about to behead somebody. Now he's like sitting with his guys and issuing orders. It's a different picture. And I think all of these people have realized they need to kind of pull back perhaps a little bit, although it's like Tourette syndrome. They keep killing a lot of Muslim civilians, and also that is their strategic weakness. We saw in Indonesia with the Bali attack in 2005, that was it, I think, for the Indonesian population. They have really, they are against Jemaah Islamiyah, which is the Al-Qaeda affiliate. We saw in Jordan with the spontaneous, the demonstrations after the Jordanian attack. We saw clerics around the world condemning the London attacks. We saw clerics around the world calling for Jill Carroll's release. These are some very positive things that are happening, because, of course, this is really going to be solved in the Muslim world. Our ability to sort of to really influence it is pretty constrained. The first piece of advice is sort of the first do no harm.
Right.
And there are. And also when we do good, like as we did in Indonesia after the tsunami, or in Pakistan after the earthquake, numbers go up. And Bin Laden's numbers are dropping in Pakistan, interestingly, from 64% to 32% right now. So, these are some positive things.
Exactly. But it strikes me that what you're saying, Peter, is that the battleground will be for mass opinion, one way or another.
Yeah.
As we conclude our conversation, Peter, I'd love to get your sense on this. Well, it's in the book. I forget whether it's in your interview or toward the end, but you make this statement. I think it is toward the end. In my view, and this is your statement, in my view, this is an intelligent political actor who is fighting a deeply felt religious war against the West. And as I read that, I began to think of, well, like all men, he's not going to live forever. He's going to be killed, captured, or die a natural death. But it may be the odd circumstance in history where a man is sort of living at the same time as his legacy. I'm sort of wondering if in this kind of decentralized terrorist world, is that really our problem now, that there's, like the Sorcerer's Apprentice, this thing is kind of spread beyond centralized control, and that we're in a kind of
the right wing,
more diffuse.
The right wing in the United States calls it leaderless resistance, and certainly Bin Laden has done that, and whether I think it's important to capture or kill him. The argument that's certainly true. This ideological movement is spread and it's out there. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try and find him. He's still important. He's still releasing tapes. They influence events. We should find Ayman al-Zawahiri. These people, they were instrumental in the founding of Al-Qaeda. It would be a big psychological victory to get them. However, the word has gone out, and it's an ideological movement which has got some fuel from the Iraq War. It's gathered some fuel because of the situation in Europe. So it's not like, I think we can have this discussion 5 or 10 years from now. There will still be a problem.
Right. Well, I think one way to tackle the problem is for everyone to read this book as I did. It's extremely helpful. Thank you, Peter. And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is also on the MHZ Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhzworldview.org. And please join us again right here next week. And thank you for watching. And thank you, Peter Bergen.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it.